Good evening, Dr. Sheerah. How are you today?
Good evening. How are you, Dr. Saad?
I'm good. I'd like, first of all, to welcome you, my dear friend. And I would like to welcome everyone to this interesting webinar at night. Today we're going to speak about public-private partnership. But before that, let me welcome you again to Advisors Free Webinars. A couple of things quickly. In order to claim your PDU, there's a Google form that I posted and Mustafa posted. Please make sure to fill in your details so that we can upload your PDUs probably within 2 days. The second thing, you will receive certificates like the ones Mustafa sent last week. He spent hours on them, so thanks to Mustafa. Probably next Sunday or Monday. The third thing, if anyone wishes to get the presentation, this is possible, but you need to fill another form, which we will be providing at the end. Now, after I introduce my friend, Dr. Sheerah, he's going to start his presentation, which is going to be very interesting with polls and everything. And once we finish, I will introduce the next session quickly. Then we will take questions and answers. So, Dr. Sheerah is a very professional. He's the person of international standard in terms of consulting, directing, leading mega and giga programs. Currently, he's a director in the Quality of Life program within Vision 2030, KSA. He used also to have a leading position in the Public-Private Partnership and the National Committee for Privatization in Saudi for some time. Before that, he used to be a program manager with the Advanced Electronic Program Director, Advanced Electronic Corporation. And he is one of the few people in our area who is certified with all the certifications by APMG on public-private partnership. I'm very happy and proud to have Dr. Sheerah as my friend and as one of our experts and advisors within our advisors family. Having said all that, I'm going to leave the floor to Dr. Sheerah. So please, thank you. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Sadi. I really appreciate this, accept all the credits you just gave to me. I'm really happy to be in this evening with this wonderful audience, with me listening to this subject, which is very important subject, I believe. First thing that I want to go through is just to add to what Dr. Saadi just said. I came from the project management field and era, from minor projects to huge project, mega projects. In this industry for more than 22 years, I've established many PMOs, and I have more than 44 professional certifications and 4 academic degrees. I worked in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and I worked outside the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in the US and in the UK for multiple projects. So I'm familiar with the projects, with the difficulties and challenges that project managers face during monitoring and managing those projects. In this presentation, I'm going to explain many things related to the 3 main categories that I'm going to elaborate on. First of all is the public work as it is, and the PPPs, then the privatization. Then I'm going to go in my story about the life cycle. What is the risks? What is the uncertainties? Are they interrelated with each other? What is the really impact of COVID-19 outbreak on the PPP projects and privatization projects? And what shall we do to overcome these kind of impacts for project managers, for private sectors, for public sector? And then we will receive Q's and A's so that we can answer you freely and address exactly your obstacles so that we can overcome them. But before that, I would love to run a poll to everyone to understand how they believe in the public-private partnerships and privatization in terms of priorities and in terms of importance. Now, in this poll, I'm going to ask if in your opinion, what is the important for countries to execute these projects in PPPs or privatization? Is it because limited resources and finances? Is it because other reasons? Just let me know why would countries choose to go with the PPPs or privatization? I'm going to give you 15 seconds just to think about that, and then we could go and surf and elaborate more through this presentation and explain why really countries choose this kind of contracting mechanism to execute these projects. We see people participating in the polls. That is good. So we have variation between limited resources or the needs for different institutions. We see also elevations in the risk allocation mitigations, and we see complementary few votes for complementary roles and drivers. Let's just wait for 5 seconds, then I will end the poll. So this will give us an idea of why country really choose this kind of instruments just to execute their public work projects. Okay, so we get 31% who say that the limited resources and finances, and 22% because of the need of different institutional mechanisms. 36% is about risk allocations. Actually, it's all about that. It's all about limited resources. It's all about finances. It's all about needed for different institutional mechanisms. And we will see in those coming slides how we're going to make sure these things are really tackled well. The first agenda between public works, private partnerships, and privatization. So in the definitions, there is no universal definition about what public works is, about PPP is, or privatization. Everyone is defining these terms in his own categories, that like the World Bank, like the IMF, like all these institutional and multilateral bank and bilateral bank. But in a nutshell, on a simplicity, if we want to simplify this, when the government come up with an idea, with projects just to fill the gaps on a national strategical development, and they want to execute in their country, they would call this public works. So it's basically traditionally executed by the government and by the resources of the government just to answer the services, answer the public, to deliver certain services and certain infrastructure for the public. Now, in PPP is the arrangement between the government or the public sector and the private sector in terms of how could we deliver those services, or how could we deliver this infrastructure to the public by financing those projects through the private sector and the banks, and ensuring the quality of service are high. When it comes to privatization is a different animal. Privatization is basically selling those assets to the private sector, and the private sector will be the owner of those assets, and make sure that he delivered those services based on the assets he bought. Now, all these three instruments are practiced around the world, and it depends on how the project would be bankable, or NPV, the net present value for those projects, and how viable those projects are, so that the government pick the right instrument to. After understanding all of these terminologies, we need to understand the framework by which we know the landscape of how the engagement of the private sector look like, starting from the public works and ending up with the privatization. So when we start with the public works, we see a lot of civil works, a lot of service contracts that's been executed by the government just to deliver services to the public, to the people in the cities, to the people in the country. So they pick the right projects and the gaps they identified on their national strategy, and then they prioritize those projects based on the needs, and then they execute them. Whether they execute them by using the funds allocated by the finance department or the Ministry of Finance, or they could engage the private sector to engage with them, and then they finance these projects. And if we take some ideas or some examples of what the public works look like, airports, postal services, stadiums, metros, those all projects or other projects like in transport projects, huge projects, could be financed by the public sector, by the government, or could be also financed by the private sector. But commonly in the postal services, for example, or other services, could be done through the public sector, and then they define the quality of those services. Then when it comes bankable, they would deliver or develop a deal or transactional deal to attract the private sector to come in. Now, in PPP, there are many forms of PPP. I'm sure that everyone have heard of many terminologies like BOT, like BOOT, like DBO, like any of those, like leasing, management contracting, all these kind of PPPs engagement or the public-private partnership contracting engagement are there. So we need to understand how these kind of PPPs, how is going to be delivered, and why they are delivered using this instrument. We can see them, and we can see them in railway, we can see them in energy field, we can see them in logistics, we can see them even in entertainment and theme parks. We can see them in everywhere. As long as the project is bankable, as long as the projects can deliver the service with high quality, and it could be financed and deliver those projects using this kind of instrument. And of course, as the poll that you participated in, it depends on the resources that the country has in terms of financial resources and institutional capabilities. So then we go to privatization. Privatization like water desalination, sanitation, and waste management, and even soccer ball, even football. We see football clubs being sold to organizations, and these organizations take the assets and run the assets, and we see football teams or football clubs where are financed totally or subsidized totally by the government. So to minimize the burden of this subsidization, we go with the instruments like PPPs. These are all about what PPP is and privatization in a nutshell. Now, in my next poll, I want to ask you, what do you think is the number one objective why government uses PPP model to execute their projects? So what is the really number one objective for the government to use this kind of instrument like PPP or privatization? Let's give this poll like maybe 20 seconds, and then we investigate and discuss this poll. Is it because we want to attract private capital investment? Is it because we want to increase efficiencies and viable available from the sector? What do you think? Just let me know. What do you think about the objective of having this kind of instrument in executing those public works projects? Numbers are rising. I see people participating. That is good. So I want your ideas. There is no right or wrong here. I want to understand how you think about why countries goes and pick this instrument in terms of objectives. What objectives they want to fulfill with regard to their whole strategy as a nation. So they want to. I see an even between the attracting private capital investment and increasing efficiency and use availability. That is good. So simply, it is basically we know that countries that they are facing some issues sometimes when in the fiscal policies or in the budgets that they are allocated every year for their infrastructure projects, or even the same, attracting private capital investments to invest money, inject capitals in the country. That would help creating jobs. That would help economy. That would help developing the local content. That would help a lot of macroeconomic impact and social economic impact. That would create jobs, develop families, and put meals on the table. And also increasing the efficiency. We know that many of those services that deliver to the public are either poor services, like the water. We see some lack of water in some areas in some of the countries, whereas there's also another like electricity, utility, and even telecom services. They were allocated totally to the private sector for the quality. And one more important thing that is the risk allocated just for the private from the public sector to the private sector. This is why this poll is very important to address. Now we're going to surf into the life cycle of the PPP. How is the life cycle of the PPP look like, and how we would really go through the stage gates of why we pick how to pick the PPP projects and how we go into these stage gates. Now, the first thing we address on the stage gates is what we call the identification. Identification means that we identify the right projects for us, and we prioritize these projects based on four dimensions. The four dimensions are institutionally, strategy, competition, cohesion, and risks. We see those projects according to these four categories, and we have a rapid assessment tool and eligibility index tool. Then we go from this stage gate to another stage gate, which is called the business cases. And when you develop any projects, in order to execute the project, in order to execute the scope of the project, you need to scope the project, you need to conceptualize the project, you need to have a case that it's really inclusive case that has strategic, economical, commercial, management, financial case that would really understand and detail the project further, and see exactly where is it viable for the private sector to engage. In this stage gate, you could say that whether this project is really viable or bankable, or you cannot finance it through the private sector, and you need to do it maybe in another instrument or by another way. Now, the next stage gate is the procurement part. The procurement part is basically we need to express we need to run this project and run this pitch into the private sector and the investors, and see the expression of interest, how interested they are in these projects. We need to qualify those after the passing over these teasers of what projects we have, we need to see the proposals that they could come up with just to fix these business cases and move on. Then it comes to the implementation where project management. So up to this level, we have the project management, which we call it pre-contracting with the private sector to execute the project. And during the implementation, we do have what we call it the life cycle management for the project management for the stage gates to deliver these kind of services and the infrastructure. Now, I call this funnels. So the first funnel, we have the first funnel here. I'm going to use the pen. So we have this funnel. In this funnel, we have many projects identified within the government just to execute, to make sure that they are filling the gaps and doing the elevating or uplifting the quality of life of the country or the cities or even the neighborhoods. And we have also, up to this, we take the good projects and we take away the bad projects from this funnel. On the second stage, we take those good projects and we take all these good projects, we take them, and then we try to identify which one of them are good after doing a detailed business cases for these projects, on which one is really qualified to go with PPP or privatization, and which one is supposed to be done by public work because it's not viable or not bankable. Then after we're done with this, we have all the PPPs identified, we have all the privatizations identified. When we go to the funnel, expression of interest. Now, here is one of the issues that governments do mistakes in. Sometimes they pass on these projects without prioritizing the project. Now, what would the investor do? The investor would pick the least risks projects, and then he would invest his money, he put his money in. Now, in this kind of ideas, we need to make sure that we are as a government, we need to pass on the projects that it's really essential, like the water, like water desalination, like sanitation of some of the neighborhoods and cities that need these kind of services. And then we try to control the market, not the other way around. Then after that, we do the implementation. In the implementation, we do the contracting, we do the processes, the assets, we see the data, and so forth. Then we go back to the output and the outcomes of the project.
Dr. Sheerah, Habibi.
Yes?
Yes. Can you go back, please, to the slide, to the other slide, and give another explanation, because some people are saying that, yes, some people are saying it's a lot of information and it's the first time they hear it. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to explain this on a nutshell and in a very briefly way. This is a stage gate by which you're supposed to pick the right project for whether a PPP instrument or whether to be subsidized by the government. So we identify the projects. We identify the projects using these five dimensions by saying how the institutional capability of the government are, and how the strategy of the government, is it aligned with the strategy? Do we have the right institutional capability? Is it cohesion? Is it really driving competitions and risks? Then we go to the next stage gates, which is the business cases. We investigate those projects that we identified earlier with respect to the business cases we develop. And we develop the business cases based on five dimensions: economically, commercially, management, financially, and strategically. So we want to make sure that the business case we develop is really fulfilling all these dimensions. So we do have a good business case, bankable and viable for the private sector who could invest his money, his capital in to execute this project. Then we go to the procurement. The procurement is basically we qualify, we pass on to the private sectors to and see how interested they are in terms of investing those capitals in this kind of projects, and we listen from them, we qualify them, and then we award them the contract based on a lot of processes. So underneath this overarching process, there are many other processes underneath it. So we have five dimensions here. We have detailed business cases, output from this stage gate, and then we do expression of interest, we do qualifications for the bidders, then we have the proposals, we evaluate them, and then we finalize the PPP and contracting negotiation. One important role in this stage is negotiation, and we will speak about this a little bit later in one of the other slides. Now, the other stage gate is the implementation. Here is where the infrastructure and the projects could be executed based on PMI, project management. We have planning, execution, monitoring, and control. We have initiation, planning, execution, monitoring, control, and closure. But in closure here, we call it hand back, where we return the asset back to the government if it's a PPP, not a privatization. This is basically what this slide is all about. I'm just conscious with the time, so I just want to give more information. So we explain here about how I illustrate this slide in terms of funnels. So we have funnel number one for identifying the projects, from the good project to the bad projects. We do the detailed business cases, and then we do the procurement of the PPPs, the bidding exercise, the qualifications of the investors. Then we do the contracting negotiation, and then we sign the contract. And during the implementation, we manage the contract, we do the process, the governance, and then we monitor the outputs and the outcomes of the PPP. Now, this is, on a nutshell, this is what the PPP is all look like. Now, this is a very important equation. It is used by PMI, but in a simplified form, just to understand if the project is useful to be executed, which is NPV. Net present value is giving you the idea. If it's positive, then this project is worth doing and worth executing. Now, in PPP, it becomes a little bit more complicated because of the initial working capital, the investment, and internal rate of return. We will explain those things, but I'm going to give you this in a very simplified idea. You know that PPPs are projects that is executed in a medium and long term. So it's from 5 years to sometimes up to 90 years. So the most important thing for the private sector and the public sector, especially for the private sector, is the cash flow, the cash in, because there is a lot of injection capital that's going to be done at the beginning of the year. So basically, private sector is not making any money at the initial term of the PPP. So here is where where the private sector going to spend or invest all its money. Now here we consider something related to what interest rate that's going to be included in this formula, used based on the financing multilateral bank or the bank that's going to finance this project. And also we look into things related to something that the bank used to evaluate the risk associated with this project. So this is where the balance sheet, where the income income statement, the cash flow going to look like based on the NPV. It is not, and this is, I want to make this clear. If NPV is negative, that is not, it doesn't mean that the project couldn't be done by PPP. Negative means that it needs some help or some aid from the government to be executed, some subsidies to be executed. And so this is what is the NPV all about. I will leave this formula with you. It is explained, and I'm going to explain further the anatomy of the PPP. Now, in the anatomy of the PPP, we have the government and the private sector. They form what we call special purpose vehicle. This is basically, so both the public and the private sector, they form a company called the special purpose vehicle. This company, if the project was identified as a bankable project, so a viable project, then the contract is signed. A company is formed between the public sector and the private sector. Usually this company is financed by debt by banks, usually 80%, usually 70%. So the percentage, the high amount will be debt financing, whereas the lower amount will be equity financing. So stocks, private sector, or even maybe they list this company, so people inject equity in this company. And this is very important factor. The bank is using this ratio to see if the deal, if the project itself could cover itself in the coming years. This ratio, it's very, very important ratio for the banks to identify whether this project could be bankable, could be used, and could be financed in the coming years. Because during the cash flow, they need to understand if this is bankable.
Ibrahim, can you a little bit? Some people ask you to slow down.
Okay.
Okay, a little bit. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So when we have this DSCR, which is debt service coverage ratio by the bank is basically use this ratio to make sure that the project could cover itself during this coming years when it comes to cash flow. The common percentage of this ratio is 1.2%. Now here is the contract, and here is when we execute any of the PPP projects. For the equity people who are investing money in this company, or the capital from the private sector, whom they want to see the return, what they care about is the IRR, and the internal rate of return. They want to see how the profitability and the return on their investment, how big or how small it is with respect to the time of years that they're going to spend their money, so that they can inject the money. Now, any of those PPP or any of those special purpose vehicle or PPPs could have one of either two types: either services paid by users, like Metro. When you go to the Metro and you buy tickets, so the money, the revenue comes on a user pay. Some of the other form of PPP is, for example, utility. When the government is purchasing these services from the private from this company or from the private sector, just to fund this private sector, is called government pay. So this is basically what an autonomy of the PPP look like. Now, this is on a nutshell. If we want to explain this further, it would take a lot of time and many other hours in explanation of how the SPV is supposed to be formed from legal perspective and from operational perspective and governance perspective. Now, in this SPV, we do have a PMO. In this PMO, this is a recommended and a typical PMO's formation or formulation in any SPV to execute these projects. We have a risk manager, we have a legal advisor. On the top, we have the PMO director, we have the financial controller, application manager, and so forth. So on. Those are a typical PMO office arrangement, but this could be changed according to SPV. Now, another poll that I want to run is that imagine that we have two famous teams, Barcelona and Real Madrid. And those are consist of known players. They're going to play with each other, but you want to predict which team is going to win. What do you call this? Is it a risk? Is it uncertainty? Is it, I don't know. Let me see the poll. Let me see, what do you think? Is it uncertainty? Is it a risk? Is it something that you you think or predict as an unknown event, or is it a certainty? I see people participating. You will be surprised and you will be shocked when you know the answer to this poll, because there is an answer to this poll. So I'm going to give it to you during my next agenda item. Okay, I see a lot of people saying a lot about uncertainties. Uncertainties be 73, 74%, uncertainties 17, 16%, 18%. Risks. Good thing about this poll, I'm going to give you 5 more seconds and see if we could conclude this. So 72% of the audience saying that this is uncertainty. What if the teams that are going to play are unknown teams and unknown players? So it will be a little bit more difficult. So in my next slides, we have to understand what risks means and what uncertainties means. For PPPs, risks basically it's unscheduled events, something that happen in the future that might or might not impact the performance of the project that we're going to execute. On the PPP to do what we call it value for money. So this is basically in this column. This is if the government want to execute this project, we see how much cost it's going to be built up if the government want to execute this project. Whereas if we do it through the private sector, we see how money we could save. And then if this show positive percentage of value for money, then the private sector will take the risks, and we will do this in PPP. This is in a simplified mode. But basically, risk means it's unplanned event. So unplanned event, if it's non-risk, it's unknown risk, then there is something what we call management reserve. Basically, in PPPs, we all concerns about two things: the cost overrun and the demand income risk. So basically, revenue issues, or we care about cost overrun for the private sector. Now those risks that I'm illustrating on my slide is basically sampling of what risk could occur and identify during the developing of the transaction of the PPP or during the construction of the, and also on all project stages. Those are typical risks that could be taken in consideration when we develop a PPP deal. But there are more. But when it comes to risks, we could identify those risks, we could identify those things, but we cannot identify uncertainties. Uncertainties are things that it's in the future, and I could not predict them, and we need to understand them. So we need to define uncertainties. Uncertainties is a lack of complete certainty. It's basically we do not have any clue of what the future look like. We do not understand how to deal with those uncertainties once they happen. And what kind of uncertainties that could happen? Maybe act of God, maybe force majeure, maybe things that's happened that we could not predict, and we need to deal with them. We need to make sure that we are ready for them. So there are many differences between risks and uncertainties means based on the events. You can manage risks, but you cannot manage uncertainties. You have to react to uncertainties, and you have to be ready for them. You cannot control the uncertainties. You have to measure and quantify the risk, but you cannot do this for the uncertainties. So that makes it difficult, really, measured and managed and controlled. Now, I give you some use cases in Saudi Arabia. For example, we have Medina Airport, which is Prince Mohammed bin Abdulaziz International Airport. That was PPP'd in 2012 with 1.2 billion Saudi riyals with build, transfer, operate, and concession with the concession. Now, it is I'm exercising. I was one of the users of this airport. I traveled from this airport back and forth. Trust me, when the airport was PPP'd, giving to services were really escalated, and really the public were really pleased with the performance and the operation of the airport, and also it creates a lot of jobs and they also improve the income of the employees, and that's really a very good case of one of the kinds of build and operate, build, transfer, operate, concession. Now, what was the impact of uncertainty. What is the impact of uncertainty on the project operation, given that we have COVID-19 outbreak? It is heavy. It is heavy because the building and operating of this airport was done by the consortium of these companies, and they need to have by the government. So government need to relieve the taxes for these. They need to give them some relief so that they can, during this outbreak, they can survive and they can continue delivering the services. Another example or another case study that I'm going to pose is water desalination. In 2019, a contract was signed with Aqua Power for $750 million US dollars just to deliver 600,000 cubic meters of desalination water per day. Now, this is a kind of a BOOT. It's built on operate this desalination plant. They will own the assets that's on this lands that the land that was given to them by the government. They will operate them, and then they will transfer these assets to the government later on after 25 years, after making sure that these services are really delivered. Now, is there any impact on by COVID-19 on these projects? Projects already started in 2019, and the project is in the building phase. So the contractors and project managers are really facing issues with the lockdown, with the supply chain, and we will talk about this also about these limitations. Now, and I'm going to run another poll, which is really controversial. Is COVID-19 a force majeure event? This is everyone is keep asking these questions all over and over and over by many contractors, and I want to know your idea. Is it a COVID? Is it a force majeure? It is an emergency event. COVID-19 event is how we could deal with it from legal perspective. What would contractor do to deal with it and overcome it, and without hitting their cash flows and hitting their performance and their operational costs? What do you think? I'm going to give you 5 to 10 seconds, and then we will talk about that. Now we see 88% from the participants votes for yes as a force majeure. We will see if it's the other remaining will participate or will vote in another category, which is no. Until now, it's 89% for force majeure, 6% no, and 3% I don't know. Okay, so the majority of the participants, of you guys, think that this is a force majeure. Let me just shock you with this news. No one could confirm nor deny if the COVID-19 is a force majeure. It depends on the situation and depends on case by cases by the for the impact in general of COVID-19 on the ongoing PPP projects. It could be additional cost for all PPP projects. It's going to impact significantly the revenues if the user funded, like the metro. If you are buying tickets to get into a train to go from one place to another place, definitely this kind of services has been interrupted by the COVID-19. If also there is a construction, if you have a construction place on sites, that's really interrupted because of the supply chain and of the labor, because they have to maintain social distancing and they have to do remote project management. So all these things, major impacts of the three major impacts of COVID-19. Still, is this these situations amount to be force majeure? It's controversial, and it depends from one contract to another. So there is a lot of debate and a lot of arguments about this kind of impact of COVID-19 of PPP projects, and it depends really on the length of the project itself, from medium to long-term projects. And of course, the lenders and the banks who are financing these PPPs, they will be reluctant to continue financing these PPPs, and they will the projects will be looking for alternative source of financing just to continue these projects, especially if these projects phase of the project. Now, also the supply chain. If you are importing steel or importing resources or importing goods from outside the country, and you wanted to get them into the country. This is another dilemma that the PPP projects might cause as an impact. Insurance policies and insurance. If you have an insurance company, of course, they are also suffering from the insurance policies that they have because the business has been interrupted, people are getting paid, and of course, of the coronavirus infected the health of the people. And finally, what would be the impact on the government? Fiscal policy. Every year, the country developed its budget, and of course, that will impact its fiscal policy, and that would have more spending and more budget bypass. Now, what would we do to overcome those three categories, which is cost overrun on the projects, the significant revenue reduction and the projects, and of course the challenges with the supply chain of the projects? If you were the public sector, government usually leaves subsidies, and we see how Saudi Arabia dealt with this by injecting a lot of stimulated packages for the private sector to make sure that things are up and running, especially for telecom, for utilities, for water, for other kind of supplies and goods. And they just want to make sure that the private sector is maintained, because we don't want to lose jobs. We want to make sure that our economy is really strong, and as well as other countries around the world, whether the countries are developing countries or developed countries. Now, this is the contract prevention, and contract prevention, public sector usually use the step-in rights just to go into the contract and manage this contract by itself, if the private sector has issues with solvency and have issues with liquidity in money to inject money. So this is what public sector usually do. Another thing is that they pass on what we call emergency measures to the PPP, just to make sure that it's operational. They might do any temporary relief for the company, and they might take away any penalties on the company just to make it up and running. Also, public sector usually supposed to do in this kind of timing after post COVID-19 outbreak, they have to manage and prepare what would need to be done after we are done with the COVID-19 outbreak. They need to look after their fiscal policies, their monetary policies. They need to attract the private sector more, and they need to make sure that they are prioritizing their infrastructure projects so that they can select the right project infrastructure want to allocate to raise and uplift and grow the quality of life. Now, what about the private sector? The private sector is basically, he's designated a task force. This is the recommended actions to the private sector while we have this pandemic and these issues. The private sector usually do a task force. This task force has to be formed with a team, with a director, with managers, with lawyers, and they have to go back and negotiate the contract with the public sector, with the government. They have to renegotiate that. They have to look into the provision of the force majeure and see if this is applicable or not, because these disparate measures that have been put in place, these are as a reaction of the not to spread this coronavirus, and as a reaction on the health and safety for the laborers. So private sector forming the team, making sure that this team is ready to deliver the services and investigate the contract in place and see if what is good for the company. Now he's supposed to prepare templates. He's supposed to produce another alternative supply chain for his on sites, and he need to do whatever it takes to mitigate the risk associated with the health and the performance of the projects on sites. So preparing templates, doing while the private sector is working remotely, he need to standardize the templates, standardize the things so that he can communicate in a very efficient way, and then he look for alternative supply chain to make sure that he's up and running. Now, also in COVID-19, there is something what we call drafting into new contracts. So sometimes they contracts. So private sector could have an advice to look into the contract again and see if he put another terms in this contract that would serve his interest when executing this project. Private sector also need to train his staff. He need to make sure that his staff is really ready or prepared in delivering this kind of things. And he's to utilize the technology to do signature availability. You don't want to look for people to obtain signature from, and keep records because of the data. You don't want to lose data. Make sure that the data are there so that they can use them, and then you learn from them in the coming projects and upcoming projects for the private sector. Now, the last poll I want to run to everyone is basically, which of the followings are the 3 key successful remote project management? Now, the private sector, when he formed this COVID-19 task force, he would manage those people remotely. So we need to know which are the 3 most important successful keys for the remote project management, to make sure that he's efficient and operational without interrupting the projects while it's executed. What do you think? Please let me know your votes. We will investigate your votes. Thank you so much. Participants are voting. I see people voting. So do we have a clear, is it important to have a clear communication collaboration? Is it important to have a data centralization, efficient monitoring, saving budget and resources? Do we need to escalate to project sponsor? What do we need to do basically to make sure that we have a very successful remote project management on site, construction site, or any of those sites, or even during the operation? So clear communication collaboration, I see 82%, 80%. I see data centralization, it's coming also. I see efficient monitoring also. So it's clear that clear communication collaboration is very important. Now, in this presentation, what we are trying to do is give you the whole story about PPP, privatization, public works, in every single part of these categories. So we have a lot of lecturing that we could do. And I will be pleased to take any of the questions that you might have to answer them during this very short presentation, just to make sure that we deliver. And I'm making this presentation as a reference to everyone. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Ibraheem. Very interesting presentation indeed. We'll start to do some questions and answers. Actually, there are lots of very interesting questions here. But
Excellent.
Before that, I'd like to wait for less than a minute. I want to invite everybody to register for next week's session.
Hi, my name is Antonio Nieto Rodriguez. I'm an expert in projects and strategy implementation. I was the chairman of the Project Management Institute in 2016. Today, I'm going to talk to you about why project management needs to reinvent itself, and project managers too. According to Gartner, by 2030, 80% of the task of a project manager will be done by artificial intelligence. So I look forward to see you in my webinar. Take care and see you soon.
Okay, let's start with the questions. Thank you very much. I think it was a heavy presentation, and there are lots of questions. I'm going to start from some of them. Okay, there were more than questions about the difference between PPP and privatization. And then there was another question that came up several times, more on the impact of each one of them. So let's start with these, then we'll move to another one.
Okay, in a very simplified way, PPP is basically an engagement and arrangement between the public sector and the private sector that is not involving asset will still remain, the ownership of the asset will still remain with the government, whereas the operation will be with the private sector. Whereas privatization, the asset will be, the ownership of the asset will be with the private sector, and the public sector will be the regulator. So the private sector will own the asset, and then we'll make it operationalized to deliver the services. This is the huge difference and huge risk profile between both of those two. This is the difference between privatization and PPP. What is the other question you just asked? I cannot hear you.
The other question is about impact of COVID-19.
Okay, it depends on where the PPP deal is. If it's during the building phase, then the construction will be impacted, and it will not going to go through the execution level, and it will be heavy because of the supply chain. If it's during the operation, for example, you build the metro and you operate the metro, but no one is buying tickets to go from one place to another. This is another impact. And these two impacts, the government stepped in to relieve the private sector from any of the taxes and may pass on some guarantees or some finance.
Okay, another question is about, somebody's asking, just a second. Okay, do you have PPP law in force in KSA or in other Gulf countries?
Yes, I was honored to be one of the founders of National Center for Privatization and PPP, and it is a PPP unit within the Ministry of Finance now, and they have what we call the PPP law. A PPP law that would really govern the relationship between the private sector and the public sector. Also, the World Bank and the multilateral banks, the bilateral banks, and around the world, IMF, they have certain rules and policies for PPPs. And in the absence of any of those laws, the contract itself could govern the relationship between the private sector and the public sector. So we in DCC we have PPP law, and also it is really recommended to incorporate clauses on those contracts to govern this PPP execution.
Okay. I think there is somebody who wants to raise their hand. Mustafa, if you can give her. Her name is Rawan. She works in the PMO. So until she join us, I will give you another question of the many questions. So we have somebody asking about, the point is, how do you face it depending on sector? Okay, how do you face the impact?
It depends on the situation itself. If it's for agriculture and water, for example, people cannot live without water. So the impact will be huge by the government. The intervention by the government is supposed to be huge. While as if it's a theme park that need to be done jointly with the private sector, could be put on hold because this is not a priority for the government to develop nowadays. They need to focus on the essential needs of the people, and then they would look into the thing that could be called for the lifestyle, for example.
Okay, very, very interesting. Makes sense. Another interesting question, what do you call force majeure event? As a French speaker, I can't say that it is a force majeure event, but an unexpected that cannot be controlled but affected the business world.
Well, here is what everyone is debating about force majeure. If it's the force majeure it was defined in different contracts indifferently. There are some certain clauses for force majeure, but unless it's proved to be force majeure, you cannot say it's force majeure. It could be an emergency event, momentarily for 2-3 months, and then it goes. It is not a kind of an act of God. It is a pandemic called, based on the World Health Organization. But what is the impact of this on the projects if the project is up and running? I understand the project, if the project, the metro or a train could have an impact, and you could exercise the force majeure. So it depends, it's case by cases. You cannot generalize, you cannot brush the whole contracts with the same brush and say that COVID-19 is a force majeure across all the contracts of PPP. This is wrong. What we can say, it is a difference from one PPP to another PPP. So it's not, we cannot generalize this settlement.
Okay. Another question, interesting one. How do public authorities differentiate between spontaneous proposals, which are solid, and those which are not? Should they consider unsolicited offers? If so, what type of process should they put in place to evaluate and possibly follow up on these offers?
Excellent question. I like this question. Unsolicited proposals are really advisable to encourage private sector participation. However, there is what we call the Swiss challenge. Once the government receives the unsolicited proposal, they need to review this proposal, and then they have to pass it on to other bidders, what we call it Swiss challenge. Everyone's supposed to bid with the same for the same proposal, for the same bid, and we will see the type of deal that could we go with. If the private sector who delivered the unsolicited proposal give us the best deal ever to do the PPP, then we will go with him. If it's not, then we have to consider other options in doing this unsolicited proposal. Now, some governments do not recommend unsolicited proposal because sometimes it touches upon the technological intelligence or blockchain or these technologies, and they have no clue how to do PPP for them. So sometimes they get confused. That is why they hire consultants like advisors to go and investigate this kind of unsolicited proposal, and then they say if these proposals going to add value to the country or not.
Thank you, Ladai. So another question. What do you think about the future trend for government for the PPP? Is it going to increase the form of PPP, especially under COVID-19?
I think one of the successful stories of PPP is the PPP that was done by the government of the United States and the healthcare companies to develop the cure for the COVID-19. I think PPP will continue happening, but the government need to prioritize their infrastructure projects so that they wouldn't invest more money on projects that would really leak their money and bleed their budgets, and they would come into issues with their fiscal policies and their monetary policies. So the government need to have an office to prioritize, as portfolio manager, prioritize the projects that need to be executed compared to projects that could be put on hold for future, not necessarily these days.
Okay. Then another question, at what stage is the engineering design and BOQs done?
Excellent. If the PPP is design, build, operate, finance, for example, and transfer, it's at the early stage of the project, they do the design phase. Now, the government, when they pass on the projects to the private sector, they do what we call it concept design. But the private sector do if the deal is design, build, operate, transfer, then the private sector will do the design, then they will do the build, then we'll do the operate. Now, the problem in this kind of engagement is that the period between the design, build, and operate, private sector needs to expedite the design phase, build phase, so that he can go to the operation to get money, the revenue in, or otherwise he will bleed money. He'll bleed money, and he will have a problem and default.
Okay. Another question about the identification. Somebody saying it's sometimes related to defining the fields of PPP, while business case is to define the viability and feasibility of the available ones.
Okay, so the question here is, I couldn't understand the question. Is it about identification?
The difference between identification and business case.
Excellent. Identification meaning, do we have a good project or a bad project? If I and you working for the public sector, and we have an idea of developing a project, those projects could become initiatives, could become ideas. They have no scope, they would have no conceptualization. So you need to do scoping and conceptualization. You need to engage the public. Do you need to do a water desalination project? Do you need to do a metro for the city? Do you need to develop this neighborhood? Do you need to do some transportation or some road projects? You need to engage people, and then you distinguish between good project and bad project. Then once you filter this, you take the good projects and do the business cases.
Okay. Then actually our time is over, but I'm gonna pass two last questions. Okay. One is asking, interesting one, is there a body of knowledge that describes the PPP life cycle?
Of course. I'm not going to advertise any of the institutions, but one which I call it the Bible of the PPP. Any references you can find for the World Bank, they have a lot of references online. Also APMG, They have a very good references they collected, and they've made certificates of CP3P. And also, and I'm certified from Washington, a specialized PPP, and I run I run in my life 3 PPP projects: one in railway, one in military and defense, and one in healthcare. So I've run all this. So the reference could be APMG. Reference book, or the World Bank that you could find online, articles and research.
Okay, our last question. What about citizen subscription in state projects? Could we consider it as PPP? Could it be another solution to issue the COVID given the granularity of the subscriptions?
Well, this is an subscriptions from citizens. It's basically, if they are paying money, they are paying money as revenues for PPPs, so they were generating revenues for the PPP company to make money. If they are participating as stockholders, so they pay equity in this company, then they will suffer if the company run out of money. So the country or the government need to inject money, and the financing institutions need to help this company to make it up and running. For example, listed company. Let's take, for example, a company like telecom company, STC, for example, or any other company. If the company, you have a share in this company, and this is a state-owned company, have a percentage of this company owned by the government. What if the COVID-19 in company? Then you will lose the share. You will lose the return of the share, the dividends. So you need a bailout for this company to make them available and make them up and running. And we would never consider them a layoff, like what happened in Boeing, happening in some of the companies.
Yeah. Thank you very much, my friend. There are more questions, but I believe we exceeded the allocated time. It has been really a very rich presentation, webinar, lots of interactions. I always would love any webinar to be the starting point for a discussion, not the end of it. So lots of interesting points of views there, lots of interesting questions. We can carry on later on. Now, before I close, I'd like to remind you with 3 things. There is a form to fill for your to claim your 1 PDU. It should be the number, the PMI number, membership number, not the PMP number. Okay, this is number 1. Number 2, if you wish to have the presentation, there is another form also listed here. I think Mustafa, tomorrow, maybe we can, within the thank you note or whatever, add these links. They should fill a special presentation in order to receive a special form, Google form, to receive the presentation. And the last note, next week's presentation, next Wednesday at 10 p.m. KSA time, it will be with another friend of mine, Antonio Nieto Rodriguez. He was the chairman for PMI in 2016. He has several books, published some articles in Harvard Business Review. I think he's still currently strategic director for GSK. He's one of Marshall 100 coaches. He's one of 50 thinkers, and so on. Like our friend Sheerah, he's a world authority. I'm sure you're gonna enjoy what he's going to tell us about the project revolution and about how project management is changing due to everything that's coming new from AI to COVID-19. Thank you very much for being with us. And I'm again happy to welcome you this week and every Wednesday, inshallah. Stay home, stay safe, and I hope to see you next week. Thank you. Hello, my name is Dr. Saadi Adra. I'm offering a webinar, Breaking Organizational Silos During the Times of Social Distancing. Join me soon.
This is Dr. Ibraheem Sheerah speaking to you from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. We'll be focusing on public-private partnership contracts and privatization contracts. See you.
Hi, my name is Antonio Nieto Rodriguez. I was the chairman of the Project Management Institute in 2016. Today I'm going to talk to you about why project management needs to reinvent itself, and project managers too. So I look forward to see you in my webinar.
Hi, this is Al Zaytoun from Washington, D.C., USA. I look forward to interacting with you on the Advisors webinar titled Balancing People, Process, and Governance for Operational Sustainability. See you then. So long.
Hi there, I'm Radia Benaria from Algeria. I'll be talking to you about emotional intelligence, leadership, and transformational change. I hope you're well. Stay safe.
This is Mustafa Fuzoğlu from Turkey. I'm offering you a webinar with advisors on digital project management.
Hi, I'm Dr. Sean Reagan from California and Prague, and I will be presenting a webinar with advisors on opportunities in crisis and complex situations, so please join me.